Hi, and welcome to part 2 of our school age video project, which is assessment and evaluation of deaf and hard of hearing children. This is module 3, where we will focus on eligibility, and we will look at the differences between IDEA, 504, and ADA. So this chart that you'll see compares some of the requirements of each of these laws, and so I want to walk you through it here. Under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Part B, for children ages 3 to 21, to be eligible, they have to qualify under one of 13 qualifying conditions. In addition, their status has to adversely affect educational performance. So if they have a condition, but they're doing well in school, they may not be eligible unless the assessment identifies some areas of concern. And their status needs to require special education and related services in order to address their needs. Somewhat different now are 504 and ADA. And here we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title II, which specifically focuses on public schools and even public colleges. 504 is a plan under a little separate but very similar to the ADA requirements. And a 504 plan can be developed for a child to provide accommodations so that they can access their instruction. But there's no specialized instruction that would come with that. They may get some supports, but not specialized instruction. So the definitions of 504 and ADA for eligibility are pretty loose. You have to have a person who currently has or has had a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, of which vision and hearing are both sensory impairments that qualify under major life activities, a record of such an impairment, or regarded as having such an impairment. So there's no additional qualifications regarding the implications of that disability. They simply have it, it's been identified, and as a result, they're eligible to receive some accommodations. Mitigating measures is a term that I'll define, but they cannot be used to exclude students. Under IDEA, for children who have IEPs, if a student is working really, really hard and meets all of their goals, they may actually test out of special education. So in some degree, some ways, they're penalized for how well they're doing. And that's a mitigating measure. Another mitigating measure could be using a hearing aid or using hearing assistive technology. So under 504, we have to consider the child just themselves with the disability without any of these other accommodations. Under 504, a plan would be written that provides accommodations to instruction, special seating, visual access, sign language, captioning, CART, similar to captioning, anything, an interpreter, anything that would give them access to the instruction. 504 and ADA are both under general education, so no special education funds are given to 504 and ADA to provide those services. The school is simply required to meet the needs of someone who meets their eligibility requirement. Something that's different, and this comes out of a brand new interpretation that was recently sent out from the Departments of Justice and the Department of Special Education, talks about the ADA requirement for effective communication. And they define effective communication in the ADA as providing communication that is as effective as it is for non-disabled peers. So within IDEA, we only have to provide a reasonable education program. But under ADA, we have to provide accommodations that are as effective in terms of communication access as they would be for non-disabled peers. So in many ways, this sets yet a higher standard. This provision, and it's not really a new provision, but an interpretation of the law, came about as a result of 2 teen cases, deaf and hard of hearing students in Southern California. Both teens requested to have captioning as part of their program so that they could effectively access instruction and communication in their classroom. Even though they may have had an educational interpreter, they may have had other assistive listening technology, they really felt that until they had captioning, they didn't have full access to the information. Originally, the school district says, no, we're meeting the law of IDEA, and that's the standard that we're required to meet. So the courts reviewed this and indeed came back and told schools that children can be eligible separately under IDEA and ADA. So again, we have a higher standard to meet for communication access or effective communication for our deaf and hard of hearing students. Personally, I think this is one of the most important interpretations that have been explained to us for deaf and hard of hearing children since the advent of special considerations, which I'll talk about shortly. So again, schools have a higher standard to meet, and so we need to talk about communication, effective communication, and decide how we're going to assess what is effective communication. Some other assessment considerations, one I call categorical confusion. Is the child eligible under the category of the disability or the problems that result from the disability? And what I see in many states is that a child who's deaf or hard of hearing will be identified as under the category of speech language because that's viewed as the primary need that they have. And while that's not illegal, it has some implications for children because special considerations, which I'll talk about here in a moment, do not apply for children with speech-language impairments. They have to apply to children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Furthermore, as we track statistics about our children, it's very important that they're accurately representing the disabilities that our students have. So if we make a student eligible under speech and language and they have a hearing loss, even though they have a speech and language impairment as a result, that doesn't represent the actual disability that they have. So I believe it's very important that we consider the categorical definition carefully so that we're qualifying these kids according to their primary disability. Now, it may be that there are kids who have additional behavior problems or learning disabilities, and then it's difficult sometimes to sort out which one came first, and then there's a discussion with the IEP team. Another consideration is extended school year. This is required by IDEA to receive FAPE. An extended school year are services that children would receive beyond the typical school year in order to meet their IEP goals, and particularly to consider the regression that occurs and the time to recoup skills after the child returns to school. ESY, or extended school year, is interpreted very differently in each state, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of case law or policy guidance. And so in the days when we pretty much routinely provided summer programs for our deaf and hard of hearing children, those often now have gone by the wayside because they have moved to this definition of extended school year and realize that unless they can document regression, they may not be required to provide services. I think the extended school year is a really sticky wicket. It varies by school district and by state, and I encourage you to get good, hard definitions of how that's interpreted in your own school district. So if children need summer services, they're able to access those. This flowchart represents how accessibility and eligibility might look. So we start with the referral for suspected disability and eligibility for services. So any child with a hearing loss who's not previously diagnosed or in special education, we would refer and we would ask, is there evidence of a disability? In other words, are they deaf or hard of hearing? And if no is the answer, then we exit this flowchart. If it's yes, then we need to assess that student to determine eligibility. I think we should start with IDEA because that's where the greatest number of provisions exist to support children who are deaf and hard of hearing. So we would go through the eligibility category under IDEA, and either yes, they meet one of the categorical eligibility definitions, and they need specialized instruction and related services. And then we would go on to develop the IEP. If they don't meet the eligibility for IDEA, we would then refer them to a 504 committee. Again, this is not special education, who would design a plan to provide accommodations for that child. You'll see a box at the bottom that says, do students require auxiliary aids and services to achieve communication that is as effective as it is for students without disabilities under ADA? And that's the question that we need to ask under the ADA provision. So regarding effective communication, if we feel that the services that have been designed under the IEP are still not sufficient to provide adequate communication access and effective communication to the classroom instruction, then we would add that provision under ADA to provide those additional services. So I think right now, states are still trying to figure this out, but I think it's very important in every IEP meeting that we bring up what is truly effective communication for students with disabilities under IDEA and their IEP, as well as under ADA. Some other regulations that may impact assessment, special factors, which I've addressed a couple of times, mentioning that the special factors require considerations of the child's language and communication needs, as well as their full range of needs. You'll have more detail on that in one of the other modules, but that's a very powerful place to look at the services that we need to provide our children and how they relate to their language and communication. And then native language, which we've also mentioned, refers to the language that they normally use. So it could include sign, it could include speaking and listening, a combination, just depending on what that child's currently using. Other regulations that may be impacted by assessment are least restrictive environment, and this requires education with non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And special schooling or special classes are allowed only when the nature or severity of the disability prevents a child from receiving a free and appropriate public education. And for deaf and hard of hearing children, sometimes this is interpreted slightly differently because we think a least restrictive environment is actually one that is a language-rich environment. And we may not be able to achieve a language-rich environment for a deaf or hard of hearing student in the general education classroom or whatever the setting is where their non-disabled peers are educated. So we may have to consider special classes or schooling for children in order to really give them education in the least restrictive environment. Accommodations for assessment have to be determined through the IEP, Individual Educational Program process, and in place prior to the assessments being administered. These are the assessments that all children take in a school. They're standardized, and the accommodations that are allowed are often dictated by the test companies themselves. So one, we have to decide what the accommodations are that children need and make sure that it's in the IEP prior to these assessments. And two, we need to check and see if they're allowable accommodations for the particular assessment that's being given. Typically, we're allowed to sign instructions for tests. Sometimes clarification can be made if it's not a reading test to make sure that children have the language to appropriately respond. But I caution you that you always check with the test companies to determine what kinds of accommodations are allowable when you have this discussion in your IEP meeting.